ever been faced with a situation that defies all the remedies your mind can think of? Do you remember how helpless and hopeless you felt in that situation, when it seemed the challenge was going to linger and persist until it took your peace or your life? There's nothing scarier than facing a problem without an idea of how to navigate your way around it. And you see yourself resigning to fate and hoping on that challenge or problem to either run its course or solve itself. The place of hopelessness in the face of a problem becomes more dangerous than the problem because you do not have the solution for it. You go through the newspapers and tabloids nowadays, and you realize quickly that the world is tipped on the edge of commotion. More problems keep rearing their heads in a world where solutions are not as forthcoming as the rate at which these challenges and evils keep rising. I remember growing up in a Bible-believing Christian home. The very first thing my mother taught me early in life was the fact that the God that we serve does not recognize limitations. My mother taught me that with God, all things are possible. Every time my mother had to teach us about how trusting in God takes care of the impossibilities in our lives, she always read a Bible passage to us. Mark 9:23. "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Did you notice where the passage says, "if you can"? There are many things in the world that are impossible for a man and natural means, but that is not the end of the story. With God, all things are possible because God's power is unlimited. The best time in the life of any child of God is that time when you realize that your affairs are being run by a God who carries the power to change impossible situations into victory. God is not limited by any chance, but we have limited ourselves because of our unbelief. In the Bible passage that we just read from the book of Mark, Jesus said to the people that everything is possible for one who believes. Your unlimited belief in God removes the barrier that blocks his way from stepping into situations. Two cannot walk together unless there is an agreement. That agreement translates into trust, and trust fosters growth in a relationship. If you can believe in God that he possesses the ability to totally reverse a solution-defying situation, the power of your convictions and your trust is the catalyst for your speedy answers and access to help that you need at the material time. Having to trust God in critical situations is easier said than done. Hope in the face of extremities is the farthest level of strength your mind can imagine. Trusting God for the impossible or in the impossible means you have to keep yourself steady and keep your mind trained on God's ability instead of looking at the situation. Trusting God requires your whole attention focused on all the impossible things he has done and how he did them. Have you ever come across the story of the Israelites before the Red Sea? Have you read the accounts of how Moses led them out of the land of Egypt? The story is full of mysterious and impossible acts of God. The journey of the Israelites from Egypt to the Promised Land remains one of the finest deeds of God. So many impossible situations they faced on their way, and each time, God was right on hand to do something greater. Listen to me, child of God. When the situation looks impossible, that is the setup for God to move, if only your trust is only in God. Faced with a Red Sea and chased by the Pharaoh and his army, it looked like a scene prepared for the end of their lives. But in the book of Exodus 14:13, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever.'" Your utterances in the face of tribulation communicate not just your words, but your faith and trust in God. When your heart fails you in the face of your problems, your faith in God is non-existent. And without faith in God, you will never see His hand in your affairs. Just like Moses stood and declared the children of Israel before that Red Sea, I say to you, child of God, look up. Look at those problems and challenges that seem impossible, that have defied all solutions proffered so far, that have stood as a stumbling block over the years, and begin to speak their end through God. Many times, I find that I am in a constant battle between my own will to begin to do everything humanly possible until I reach the end of my humanity. I have gone through unnecessary pains and agonies, nights of toil and prayers. I have suffered unnecessary injuries to my life and worth many times because I gave in to my human instincts. And when I hit the limit of my trials, I succumb to the hopelessness, and the struggle becomes part of me. But I found a Bible passage while scrolling through a journal online, and the words of that passage became the light to my path. I found peace, joy, contentment, and most importantly, ease in dealing with my daily struggles. Isaiah 23:6, you will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord is the rock eternal. I found peace trusting in God, and that peace translated into God becoming my rock. Listen, those things you feel are impossible today, if you try, no matter how little your faith is, if you try to hand that situation and your whole operation over to God, you will find ease. George Mueller once said, faith does not operate in the realm of the possible. There is no glory for God in that which is humanly possible. Faith begins where man's power ends. Where your imagination ends is the beginning of the thought of God. The only path to true living in dominance over your life's toughest battles is trust in God. God does not glory in your defeat, neither does heaven derive joy from our sufferings. But we have limited ourselves to our human abilities, thereby shutting the access through which unsolvable problems are resolved. God. Jesus, one day, was teaching in the mountains for days, and a group of his followers gathered around him in their thousands to listen to him. The more Jesus spoke, the more people gathered, and this was a normal characteristic of the ministry of our Lord while on earth. But one day, Jesus looked up after many hours of teaching, and he saw that the people needed to be fed. Remember that these were not just his 12 disciples and the few followers he went about with. This was a crowd of over 5,000 people. Due to the crowd, Jesus had retreated into a more secluded area away from the town, and the people followed in thousands, and now he wanted to feed them. I can imagine how confused the disciples were when Jesus told them to instruct the people to sit down and get ready to be fed. They knew that no arrangements for food or welfare had been made beforehand. They are aware that the coffers had no money, and even if they did, they knew how difficult it was going to be to get enough food that would feed a crowd that was the size of a small city in their days. I can imagine many of the disciples were whispering amongst themselves how the Master wanted to achieve this feat. The only things they had as food for the whole crowd were 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That food was only enough for 5 men, and Jesus intended to feed over 5,000 people with it. This was a completely impossible situation for a human man. There's no possible calculation in the human frame of mind that can feed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But in the book of Matthew 14:18, Jesus said to them, "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces that were left over. What is that situation that looks like it cannot happen? What do people say to you about that plan of yours? About how impossible your health challenges are? What do people tell you about your financial situation? What does your mind say about your own battles? Consider Jesus Christ. His mindset was never set on the situation on the ground. The available resources or the unavailability of them were not his concern. His mind and his faith were trained and steady on the ability and the possibility of his intentions. He lifted his eyes to heaven and gave thanks. He didn't ask heaven for the miracle to increase the bread and fish. His faith and trust in the ability of God to do that already handled the impossible situation before it even occurred. When you see a man or woman around you enjoying the level of ease and comfort, check very well that that man or woman is totally sold to the idea that nothing is impossible with God. Child of God, do not look at the challenge. Do not train your mind to look at the complexities in the situation instead. Train your mind to trust God, that before any problems arise, He is capable. That is the secret to living in victorious bliss in life and destiny. Put your trust in the God of the impossible. Jesus Christ, while he was on earth doing his ministry, had to use many means of transportation to move around sharing his gospel, and one of such was a boat ride across rivers and seas. On one such trip, Jesus was so tired that he went into the main bowl of the ship they were on to catch a little sleep, and while he slept, the ship ran into turbulence at sea. The situation became an emergency. The storm was so fierce that the disciples began to panic because, evidently, the ship was about to sink. They were toiling and trying to maneuver the ship away from the storm when they realized Jesus had been asleep all this time. In the middle of the sea, caught in a storm, the ship at the edge of sinking, the whole crew and disciples were scared out of their wits, trying to save the boat and themselves. And here was Master Jesus sleeping peacefully and undisturbed in the same ship. The situation looked like the end until the disciples went to his side and woke him up. The Bible records in the book of Mark 4:39, "And he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, 'Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith?' Who you look up to determines much of what you receive." The disciples knew that they had Jesus on the boat. They were aware that they had a solution on the boat, but that solution was not available to them until they stopped applying their human abilities and cried out for Jesus instead. As a child of God, the only limitation to your success in difficult and impossible situations is your trust in God. Make a decision today to leave all your affairs to God. Put your total trust in Him and enter into a life of victorious existence and ease.